Douglas Murray, we are pretty close. Whether it's weeks or months or however long they stay just under the nuclear threshold of Iran being able to do this. Give us your view of what the effect then is, particularly on Israel, but on the region generally.
Well, the first thing is there are obviously sort of two egg timers that have been turned over in relation to Iran. One is its seeking of nuclear power and nuclear capability and indeed deliverable nuclear device. And the second, of course, is the longevity of the regime. And so much to do with this depends on which of those egg timers runs out first. If the regime finds itself in deep trouble, first of all, and indeed is able to be overthrown by the people, who I agree have a great pro-Western tendency, then the outcome would be one way, and I think a preferable way. If, however, the current regime in Iran manages to get to the nuclear threshold and indeed step beyond that, then really it's all open. I mean, if you like what the Iranian revolutionary government does now, you're going to love what it'll do when it's nuclear. It already, and I think too little recognised in this country, it already acts as an extraordinary destabilising force within its own region. Don't forget what it's been doing in recent years in Syria, and even in recent months. I mean, there have been people now protesting on the streets of Iran saying, why are you funding the slaughter of our brothers in Syria, and we don't have enough food here in Iran? There are all sorts of things that the Iranian revolutionary government has done since 1979 to destabilise Syria, the Lebanon, Israel, and elsewhere. So, to my mind, even if you take the proliferation aspect of this off the table, the impact of Iran exercising its power as a nuclear power across the region is a terrible thought.
Douglas Murray, you've been in Pyongyang not so long ago. We've just been talking about proliferation. Before we return to the Middle East, I just want to put it in context for the rest of the world, because in a week's time, it's possible that North Korea is going to test its latest missile. And proliferation is not just about the Middle East, of course. There are worrying signs in South America and, of course, Asia itself.
Yes, I mean, there are all sorts of lessons which rogue regimes take from regimes which both pursue nuclear weaponry and those that give it up somewhere along the route. And if you just take one example, which has been sort of skipped over, I find, in Britain and various NATO countries, take the example of Gaddafi. Gaddafi volunteered up his nuclear program after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, volunteered it up to the British and Americans, and that attempt he had made was much more advanced than most people outside realised. Now, fast forward nearly a decade,
so he ends up dead.
Exactly. Fast forward a decade, Gaddafi has internal problems and starts massacring people, but the international community steps in, NATO steps in, Gaddafi is dead.
NATO would not have dared step in. If he had a mass missile, he would have loosed on Brussels.
Exactly. So, if you are the Kim dynasty in North Korea, if you are any other regime which is either near nuclear capability or has just trodden somewhere over it, then you take the lesson that you must never give up nuclear capability, you must never give up the search. It is the only way you will cling on forever.
In my view, it shows the failure of international criminal law. If there's anyone who deserves to be in prison for life, it's A.Q. Khan, the merchant of death.
Douglas Murray.
If anyone listening hasn't heard of A.Q. Khan, it's perfectly understandable, but your children will hear about him. He will become known in history as the person who I think is most responsible for proliferation across the region and the world.
Well,
Shirley Williams.
A.Q. Khan was terrible, and I don't disagree with that. But I don't think that believing that getting rid of the NPT would in any way help. The only chance we have of a world which begins to get control of nuclear weapons is by way of international. I agree about international law. What I'm doubtful about with Jeffrey's proposal is that it's short-term purpose.
Shirley, you just mentioned NPT. We should again explain NPT, Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, about the only thing that the world has got at the moment, which is supposed to stop this terrible problem spreading and spreading.
And I just wanted to say that I think, in fact, it has been more successful than most, not completely successful, of course not, but it's more successful than some, at least, of our interlocutors in this table suggest, because the fact that Iran is still a member of NPT is one of the reasons why I think it is not about to pass the
So
threshold.
states have a choice of being part of this, which means nuclear inspections.
It means a huge number of inspections. In the case of Iran, a huge number
I'm
of
sorry,
inspections.
Shirley, Iran just refuses to allow
No,
the inspectors
that
into
won't
Parchin.
do.
That it's believed that Parchin is, and they have a
in fact-
lot of information that Parchin
They have
military
in fact
base in
just
Iran.
said that there will be an inspection of Parchin. It's a
They play a
military.
game of hide
It's
and
a
seek.
it's a military base. But
you
let me just finish
So,
my
sorry,
argument for a minute.
can I just before you do that, to explain to people, if you don't join the NPT, if you say I don't want any part of this,
Right.
what then happens? What's the sanctions?
Well,
on
up
you?
until the, I think, disgraceful agreement between the Bush administration and India, there was a quite powerful control through the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which meant that they would not pass on material and weapons, instruments that could make weapons. That was broken by George Bush. I think it was a dangerously irresponsible thing to do, and he agreed to allow India to breach the NSG. So the real problem with the NPT at the moment is not that it doesn't exist, it's not that it doesn't inspect, it's not that it hasn't got some very excellent inspection teams. It is that there are 3 countries outside it.
4.
Well, 4 if you include North Korea. The 3 countries outside it are India, Pakistan and Israel. And I agree with Geoffrey, there's a real element of hypocrisy in all 3 countries in their attempts to suggest that somehow they're on the right side of the nuclear issue. If you get rid of the NPT, as distinct from trying to improve it, what you will do is considerably worsen the position. The world is full of potential AQ Khans. So far they have not got very far because they have mostly been stopped before they could get anywhere. But if you get rid of that structure, God help us, because we then are in a world of anarchy, and I think that would be insupportable.
And is this the answer, Douglas Murray, to the a lot of people? We've experienced 60 years of, as it were, nuclear balance and MAD, and there hasn't been a nuclear war. And there is I think among a lot of people there's a general feeling that nuclear weapons have kept the peace, and that we can therefore somehow relax about this.
Oh yes, absolutely. I think there's a degree of relaxedness about it, and indeed about a lot of this conversation, which is very troubling. I mean, most people's paradigm of this is the Cold War, is the standoff between the West and the Soviet Union, is the idea that rational actors were aware that at the ultimate resort it would be annihilation on all sides, and it wouldn't be worth it. If you take even of the countries that have just been mentioned, leave North Korea out for a second, you take Israel, and Pakistan and India. These 3 countries have, I would argue, a situation which is not too dissimilar from that. Between India and Pakistan, you have a form of standoff. Both countries feel themselves that they need to be nuclear armed in order to prevent the other's aggression and so on. This is, to an extent, you could see India and Pakistan as a standoff of a Cold War kind. In the case of Israel, why does Israel seek to have nuclear power? Because every few years, until it was a nuclear power, its neighbours en masse went over its borders, invaded and tried to eradicate the whole state. Now, you could argue that since Israel has been nuclear, its neighbours haven't tried to do that. They've tried to do it in unconventional ways, but not in the conventional way of rolling tanks all over, because they knew that could be endgame. So for Israel, this is a deterrent of that kind. The problem you get once you get towards Iran going nuclear and everyone else in the region going nuclear is that with all of the animosities travelling in every single direction, everybody has nuclear weaponry pointed not in one direction, but in every direction. What you have then is what I would describe as a Mexican standoff.
There are too many tripwires in too many directions.
Where by the time the shooting has finished, nobody knows or is around to know who started it.
So I would hope, although I fear that Israel will bomb next year, I think that would be counterproductive in every which way.
Shirley Williams and then Douglas Murray.
Very briefly, I think that it's quite clear, as David said, that sanctions are working on Iran, that there has been a 2/3 fall in the rial, the currency, that they are really serious issues now about people keeping alive, and there's an election coming up next year, not with Mr. his time is gone, but an election for a new president, and it's highly unlikely that the situation with sanctions would not have huge political repercussions. It's already having them.
Douglas Murray.
If I could just come on this issue of the window of opportunity. The window of opportunity, I agree, is there, and it's been massively lengthened in recent months and indeed years. I've, for about 6, 7, maybe more years now, had conversations of when a strike was going to happen by international forces or Israel or America and so on. The reason why nothing has happened is because something which should be mentioned. There have been massive behind-the-scenes efforts, not only to do with sanctions, but massive behind-the-scenes efforts that have very successfully helped delay Iran's project. Two are worth flagging up in particular. The first is the deployment of computer viruses. Everyone's heard about the Stuxnet virus and so on. These are extremely intelligent ways to delay the Iranian nuclear program. The second, and undoubtedly far more controversial, is the issue of nuclear scientists in Iran, as it were,
being assassinated,
dying before their time in the middle of rush hour traffic. Now, I have to say, nobody knows who is responsible for this. It could be any number of actors in the region. People tend to assume that it's Israel, but there are a large number of actors in the region who would have an interest in delaying.
But do you think that's actually slowed the program down? I think it sends a message, but I don't think the odd nuclear scientist assassinated has slowed down. Stuxnet certainly did, but the assassination's not so sure.
But the combination of these two things, I agree, Stuxnet is certainly undoubtedly more effective in slowing down. But the combination of these two things does something, which means that the window we are talking about has continually been lengthened.
But assassination is outrageous.
I absolutely agree.
And I mean, Israel talks of a surgical strike on Iran, but the problem is there are 5,000 people working at Natanz. Any strike will kill them. There are 370 tons of uranium hexafluoride in the Iranian facilities. Once you bomb those and a cloud moves in the right direction, you're killing thousands.
Just before Douglas responds to that, we should explain that you've actually been involved in, you've watched some of the wargaming, as it were, about what might happen if there was an Israeli strike.
No, I can't say I've been involved.
I'm sorry, I've got that wrong. I'm sorry, that was David. I beg your pardon. David's been...
I've seen some of the projections, as it were, of it, but I don't want to...
Same question to David.
Yes. Well, I was in Israel recently and I watched them wargame an attack on Iran. I mean, as you know, wargame is where everybody plays the parts of different actors. So there are people playing Hezbollah, people playing Iran, people playing America, people playing Israel, and it worked out quite well for Israel in the Israeli wargame that I watched. I'm somewhat...
see the Iranian wargame?
No, alas, no, they didn't let us in. But I'm not so sure it would go quite so well for Israel as it did in the wargame.
I'm certainly wouldn't be one of those. I don't think there's anyone who thinks that any strike by anyone on Iran as the last resort would be anything but extremely messy, both regionally and locally and everything else. But I just raise this issue because the date of the strike, everybody for years has kept on saying, and nearly a decade now has been saying, within the next 6 months, the window of opportunity. My point is the window of opportunity has kept on being lengthened. And there is a reason for this, because neither America under Bush or under Obama, not Israel under any of its leadership, wants this as a preference. Nobody is for a strike. But there are some people, and I would include myself among one of them, who believe that if at the very, very last resort it was perfectly clear that Iran was intending to go nuclear and after that point the mullahs would be entrenched forever, then it may be necessary to make a strike. Whoever would be involved. That might be Israel, it might be America and Israel, it might be some other forces. But that as an ultimate resort, action should be on the table.
Shirley Williams.
2 points right away. The first is that Douglas is quite right about tremendous efforts made, mostly by the Obama administration, to try to stop any kind of strike. I don't think he's quite right in assuming that degree of restraint in Israel. Mr. Netanyahu has used some very, very militant language indeed, and indeed he sees his own electoral prospects.
They haven't started a war, though. Actually,
absolutely, he hasn't had the chance to. Can I may I finish? You guys have all had a go. Come on. Its electoral prospects turn to some extent on being seen as taking a very militant attitude towards the Arab world and also towards Iran, which is not, of course, the Arab world. That's very important. He's going to use that kind of rhetoric. I think he was stopped by Obama and to some extent, lesser extent, by the Europeans, thank God. I also think that we are not facing up in this conversation to the fantastic consequences we might get. For example, Iran has got major control over the state of Hormuz, the Gulf of Hormuz. It is capable of...
Through which the oil comes.
Through which the oil comes, and at the moment we still need oil, maybe not in the future, but we do now. We're likely to tip the whole world into a second recession very, very quickly, and that's going to be a recession that lasts for a very long time. And not least, I think we don't recognise the extent to which Iran is a state much respected by the Shia element in the Arab world, and that means that all through the Middle East there will be acts of terrorism and acts of barbarism and so forth in order to stop this coming about. The consequences are so grave that we really have to stick with trying to get diplomacy to work.
Douglas Murray.
The consequences are all grey. However, the blackest of all is a nuclear set of weaponry in Tehran under the control of the mullahs. Very quickly, on the Straits of Hormuz, you hear this a lot, so it's just worth mentioning. If the Iranian government closed the Straits of Hormuz, the Iranian fleet would find itself on the bottom of the floor of the ocean the day after.
But Douglas, you've left out completely the fact that security people in Israel and in America all agree that it would be most unwise and foolish
If
to
I
have
may
a
say so,
strike.
Shirley, you do listen to the Israeli and American officials that you want to. There are many different...
Benny Gantz?
I knew you were going to
Former
mention
head
Benny
of
Gantz.
Mossad?
I knew
All
you were
right.
going to mention Benny
it's
Gantz.
actually-
But my
That
simple
long.
point would be, Shirley, that there are many other people in Washington and in Israel who think differently from
I
you.
think Iran is worse than
I've-
Iran getting the bomb.
I agree 100%.
Douglas Murray and then Shirley Williams.
I like the idea because anything that gives off a signal, as it were, that this is intolerable, I think is a good thing. But, the old cliche is that the people in the army, generals, think that force is the answer to everything. In my experience, that's not true at all. But that's an old idea. It tends to be the case that diplomats think that diplomacy is the only answer, and politicians think that you need more politicians. And in my experience, lawyers do think that the answer to everything has an answer in law. And although I wish it were the case.
Like Lord Justice Leveson,
It's-
suggesting.
it is certainly an aspect of it which I think is very important.
And a final thought from Douglas Murray.
Yes, the window of opportunity should be one which we hope, at the end of which the mullahs are no longer in power. I mean, that is the real hope at the end of all this, that Iran can return to being a normal, decent country. It deserves a place in the region, it deserves a place in the world, but that place cannot be held as long as the mullahs are in charge.
The state that terrorized